I am thrilled to welcome everyone both in the room with us today and online. We're getting some participants in to the Armenian Institute's event, Reimagining the Armenian Diaspora-State Relationship. I am joined by four panelists, including Erica, program manager online. And I will begin by introducing Razmik Panossian to my left, who is the director of the Armenian Communities Department at the Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon. Some of you will know him in the room as one of the founding members of the Armenian Institute. It's a nice return.
I was there by killing boxes.
Yeah. It was manpower. Yeah. And then hopefully some of our younger audiences who are in the field.
Recording in progress.
Perfect. We'll know him from his much cited and acclaimed book, The Armenians, From Kings and Priests to Merchants and Commissioners. To my right is Sossie Kasbarian. Sossie is a co-editor of several publications, including the Armenian Diaspora and Stateless Power, Collective Identity in the Transnational 21st Century, Avedissian, 2023, the most recent publication. She's currently working on her monograph entitled The Armenian Middle East, Remnants, Resilience, and Reconfigurations. Sossie is co-editor, importantly, of Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies, and joins us from Edinburgh today. Tatiana der Avedissian, again, several of you will know her face in the room. She's our beloved chair of the Armenian Institute and wears several hats. She is a communications and sustainability expert based in London. She's head of business development for the World Ocean Initiative at the Economist Group and leads her own consultancy. Today, she comes to us in the capacity as co-founder of the Armenian Project and co-president of the Harvard Kennedy School Women's Alumni Network. And finally, Vicken Cheterian is a lecturer in history and international relations at the University of Geneva. He's a former journalist, having published extensively, you all might be familiar with his 2015 publication, Open Wounds, Armenians, Turks, and a Century of Genocide. He's currently writing a book on the Armenian diaspora. So, welcome back.
Erica Paye, who is as I said, our program manager at the Armenian Institute. She is an art historian with a PhD from the Courtauld Institute in London, where she specialized in the history of photography and photojournalism. Again, many of you will recognize Erica's name from email, but she also was critical in working on the Heritage of Displacement Oral History project, which I'm very happy that, again, many people in the room contributed to. So now I pass the mic on to Erica.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks for your kind introduction. I hope you can hear me well online and in the room. Thank you for your kind introduction. I just want to say a few short words before we let our speakers say more things about our Heritage of Displacement Oral History project. I know many of you know what it is. It's a project that we've been doing since 2023, and it aims to gather the testimonies of UK Armenians in oral history form. So we focus really on what the Armenian diaspora in the UK is like. It's like a snapshot of what it's like. And at the same time, we're trying to touch upon specific identity markers, perhaps, of what that is. What I like in Heritage of Displacement is that it focuses on several generations and generational gaps as well as links between people. So it's been a fascinating project that will soon make even more public. In the meantime, we're really delighted that the project is included in a British Library display this autumn. So the British Library has produced a display in its treasures gallery of items from their collection that highlight Armeno-British communities and interactions. So what's original in this display, of course, is the inclusion of audio clips from our oral history Heritage of Displacement project. I'll put in the chat a link where you can listen to these clips that are in the exhibition. And what I wanted to say now to introduce this evening is that all these clips that are included in the British Library display are kind of divided by themes. And one of the themes is called Armenia. And it gives a picture of the variety of comments and reflections that UK Armenians have to say about and about their relationship to the Republic of Armenia. So now, not to take too much time, I just want to list a bunch of those themes that come back in different interviews of UK Armenians. So they talk about the language differences between the diaspora and Armenia. They talk about some accounts of their visits to the country and whether they identify and have a feeling of belonging with it, or they lack this identification. And that can be with Armenia or with Turkey and its, landscapes, towns, places. And that often depends on where they grew up in the world, this feeling of belonging or not. They talk also about reminiscences of Soviet Armenia and, the cultural gaps with their own diasporan culture, but also ways to bridge those gaps. That's also very interesting. They talk a lot about what diasporans can do to help Armenia. So there's this notion of a duty or responsibility to do something to aid the country to face its difficulties, notably. So there are a lot of comments on the narratives that circulate about Armenia worldwide. And there is also this idea of educating others worldwide about the Armenian state. That comes back a lot. Then we have a series of people who grew up in Armenia, but are now part of the diaspora, came to it recently. And so these people give detailed details of sensual memories of the country, colors, sounds, food, community life, traditions, and that's also very valuable. There are two more things. We have a lot of people sharing very generously, actually, some memories of historical events. So we've got memories from the time of the independence, memories from wars, but also from times of peace, the memory of the birth of a sense of patriotism in Armenia. There are also discussions of, historical repatriation campaigns, which I find a very interesting topic to dive into also. And finally, we find this idea that diasporans have an awareness of how much the country is changing and how the country is changing thanks to their distance and their regular visits. So there is indeed many things that diasporan Armenians can bring to the discussion and to the analysis of tonight's topic, thanks notably to their position outside of the country. And the methodology of oral history has proven very efficient for that and opposite. So I'm happy that we can share these clips with you. I'll put the link soon in the chat. And I want to now let our speakers make a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. So to Erica's point on methodology, I'd like to begin jointly with both Vicken and Sossie as scholars, and particularly Sossie, your role as an editor, shaping the discourse of diaspora as a field of study. What conceptual tools or frameworks do you think that we should use to rethink diaspora today, even as we've said it about 50 times since starting the event? But can we ground ourselves in a discipline, perhaps?
Thank you, Erin, and thank you to you and the Armenian Institute and my fellow panelists and all of you for the opportunity to have these conversations. I'm going to answer your question slightly differently, and I'm going to use a kind of interdisciplinary lens here and look at diaspora and diaspora studies through three distinct but intersecting disciplinary prisms, if you like. So within politics and international relations, which is my main field, what we see, certainly in the last 2 decades, is this proliferation of diasporas and diaspora experiences, which have become increasingly commonplace. So those of us who started doing work on diaspora studies before that period, it's actually so interesting to see how commonplace understandings of diaspora, experience of diaspora have become through forced displacement, through war, economic migration, environmental migration, and so on. And what is partially, at least partially driving this, are states viewing their migrants abroad in a different way. So viewing them as potentially valuable assets to be cultivated, as players in global politics, whether they are voters that can determine, narrow elections, investors back home, providing remittances, and so on. So we are familiar with a number of state-generated and state-led diaspora. I'm thinking of India, Turkey, but many other examples, countries that are, in a sense, kind of using the traditional triadic model of diaspora, the home and host state, and almost imposing it on their migrants abroad, some of which have been away for many generations. And here I'm thinking of Scotland, where I live, but also Ireland, sort of rebranding people of Irish or Scottish background as diaspora, many, many generations later. So we see this diaspora as fitting an increasingly deterritorialized world, and countries courting their migrants for tourism, for investment, but also as having potentially political clout in their home states. Secondly, from the scholarship on diaspora studies, I think when we approach the Armenian diaspora, we have centuries of living in diaspora. And this is not a diaspora that emerged from the state-generated perspective that I just shared. So within scholars of diaspora studies, here we see the Armenian diaspora as a really exciting case to be looking at old diaspora as we are very much in a world of new diasporas. What can old diasporas tell us? How are they being also reimagined in a world of new diasporas? And finally, from the perspective of Armenian diaspora studies, and again, Erica mentioned this too, I think that one of the aspects where we can really think about doing more research is looking at the new diaspora. And here we're thinking the post-Soviet migration, who since the 90s are not just migrants, they are a diaspora now very much, in many cases dominating older communities, in many cases having some distance from established communities, in other cases mixing, and indeed kind of setting a different kind of infrastructure and a relationship to Armenia. So that would be kind of, the area that I think that we should be kind of reimagining our kind of diasporic perspective vis-a-vis the homeland.
Lovely. And this issue of a contemporary diaspora and studies on contemporary diaspora are of mind right now. Vicken, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, Sossie already presented what's happening in the academic field. When we come to the case of the Armenians, I would say that we went through different periods. In the early period of the Armenian movement for independence in Armenia, there was this immense enthusiasm towards the diaspora. There was this imaginary diaspora that was going to solve most of the problems of Armenia. And very quickly there was disappointment. There was a clash, political clash between the Armenian government and some diasporan parties. And in the second period, very much like Sossie described, the Armenian government tried to instrumentalize the diaspora, tried to use the diaspora as a source for, a financial source to solve some of the problems of Armenia. And now, as if we are back to a period where the Armenian government sees the diaspora on the political field as a troublemaker, but on the other hand, tries to create bridges and possibilities of cooperation with individuals and small groups. From the side of diaspora, we also went through different periods. And what I'm describing, it's periods where there's lots of emotion, right? Dominating our way of thinking. In the diaspora, I would say that the early Karabakh movement was a source of worriedness. The diaspora was not prepared to see suddenly Armenia changing, and the thought that Armenia might be divorced from Moscow and then exposed to Turkish violence was a major issue in the diaspora. And after that, the diaspora, at least its organized elements, put their efforts, their emphasis, their thinking towards issues in relation with Armenia and Karabakh. And I think now it's been 3 decades where suddenly we see more and more people saying, but maybe it's time that we refocus on what is happening in the diaspora itself, and there's a lot going on in the diaspora.
Exactly. You touch on this point of diaspora and engagement and kind of weighing, kind of walking a narrow line. Razmik, do you want to speak about institutionally what you see as some of the limits of engagement in the diaspora, both as a granting institution, organizing institution, and then also on the other side on the ground?
Sure. Let me first emphasize one point that both Vicken and Sossie mentioned. We're talking, when we say diaspora, we're talking really about very broadly 2 distinct diasporas, the old established post-genocide diaspora and the new post-Soviet diaspora. These are different diasporas, different in many respects. We've generally, when we're talking today, I think we're talking about established diaspora, the institutionalized, established post-genocide diaspora. The post-Soviet diaspora, a lot more research needs to be done on that. The imaginary diaspora that we can mention sort of comes to the point of what you're asking, Erin. All these years, since 1988, 89, I would say, and more emphasized since 1991, all these years there is an assumption still today that if Armenia or someone finds the magic key to unlock the diaspora, everything will be fine. Remember the quote-unquote good old days when there was this statement of Azerbaijan has oil, Armenia has a diaspora, okay, notwithstanding the fact that you're compared to a slimy substance, but still, there was this notion that if we only find the right key to unlock the potential of the diaspora. For 35 years, we've tried this individually, collectively, institutionally. Perhaps at this point, we should think, maybe there is no magic key. Maybe this is it. This is the diaspora. It will come together. It will mobilize, do what it can at moments of crisis, earthquake, war, major economic meltdown, whatever. The rest of the time, this is it. It's not going to do anything more. It cannot do anything more. And it seems to me the Armenian government has sort of come to this realization. They really want a diaspora that is what Sossie was saying, Armenians abroad that they can tap into. And the other pesky diaspora, that's the post-genocide established diaspora, that's too political, too involved, too emotional. Maybe we don't need that diaspora. And I think at this moment, that's where we're at. And so and the diaspora is a bit lost at this moment. And the diaspora is thinking through, okay, if that's the case, what's my role? What's my role as an institution? What's my role as a person? And we don't have clear answers yet. I think there is a period of rethinking about these issues, and that's what we're about. That's what we're doing. Now, maybe later I'll come to the idea of how to institute change, because that's another part of this, but I don't want to talk too long now, so I'll stop there and then come back to some of these issues.
I'd like to move to Tatiana. Obviously, the Armenia Project works inside of Armenia and it promotes the image of Armenia to the diaspora. Could you speak more to the objectives of the project and then also what you're seeing as a result of some of that positive media?
Yeah, so the Armenian Project is an educational nonprofit based in Armenia that is aiming to help tell the Armenia story to an international audience, and we do this through a number of pillars. One of them is through internship training. So we invite interns from US, UK journalism schools to come and intern with local English media in Armenia. And we also offer internship opportunities for local Armenians who want to intern with those media organizations. We offer training and workshops for media professionals. That includes PR professionals, not just journalists. And then, of course, we facilitate travel for journalists to Armenia. And we have supported the travel of over, I think it's like almost 70 journalists now, off the top of my head, to Armenia. A lot of this sort of started off because of the fact that we saw that there was a gap in the way in which we as Armenians, whether we be in the diaspora or in country, tell the story of Armenia. I want to say that I see this in a slightly more positive way, because having this organization and constantly going back and forth, and the experience that I hear about from our interns, in fact, we have an intern here with us today, but also from the youth in Armenia, I think it's slightly a different experience. There's more young diasporans from around the world keen to move out there. There's more of them that are engaged than ever before. So the Armenian Project, to clarify, is wholly funded by the Hovnanian Family Foundation, which also funds Birthright Armenia, the Armenian Volunteer Corps, Repat Armenia. And their stats tell us a bit of a different story, because they had, on average, since the establishment of the Birthright Armenia organization, about 100 to 200 people. In the last 6 years, that's increased to over 250, and about 12% of their alumni are now living in Armenia. And so more than ever before, we're seeing a larger engagement.
So it's retention and repatriation.
Exactly. Yeah. And Repat Armenia, which provides support services, is getting an influx of people coming in with inquiries about how do I move there. And I have to say, sort of with my with my Cypriot also diaspora hat on, there's nothing like that in the Cypriot, for the Cypriot diaspora who want to go to Cyprus to pay for that. So to answer your question, what we felt was that we needed to climb a mountain to tell Armenia's story, both to an international audience, but also to a diaspora that, what is it? The estimate is, and we need more data on this. I do want to stress that we're very bad at collecting data, both within the diaspora, and all respect to the project that we did together on the Armenian Diaspora Survey, but that might be one of the few research projects that really tries to understand, what the flows are between diaspora and Armenia. But they estimate, and this is an estimate from 2017-19, 10% of the diaspora have been to Armenia. I'd argue that that number is much higher today, but we need to do more to track that information so that we can really have a more robust conversation on diaspora engagement within Armenia today.
Great.
Can I, since you mentioned the Armenian Diaspora Survey, let me give you some figures, which sort of is the macro numbers to the micro examples you gave. This is a survey that those of you who don't know that did a public opinion survey of 13,000 Armenians in the diaspora in 10 countries, 50 communities, the pilot phase of which was led by Susan. And this data, only small part of it is yet analyzed. So there's lots of work to be done here in terms of analyzing. But the overall figures, some of the numbers are this: 54% of the people surveyed said that their identity is hyphenated. So they're Armenian British or British Armenian, or they're Lebanese Armenian. So 54%, that's about half, slightly half. Interestingly, in places where we don't expect, in Lebanon, 76% said that their identity is hyphenated. A small percentage, well, about 36%, I think, said they're Armenian. So we looking at the diaspora that has dual identities, that has multiple identities, but at least two. How they define their Armenian identity? 72% they've said it's family, 55% said language, and only 17% said the Republic of Armenia. So in terms of how you identify yourself, Armenia was way at the bottom. Where is your homeland? 52% said where they were born, and 43% said Armenia is their homeland. And then 30% said where I live. I mean, the percentages are add up more than 100 because they could choose three, I think, yeah. So we've seen that and the survey, if you really analyze it, well, you can see the difference between old comers, newcomers, etc. But the overall thing says that diasporans are seeing themselves as diasporans. They're identifying themselves as diasporans, and they have a connection to Armenia. So some people are moving to Armenia, but most people are not going to move to Armenia. They might go there, come back, whatever, but their homes are in the diaspora. So it is in this reality that I think we have to think through some of the questions or some of the policies, because we all want to do things for this community, right? And for Armenia. So that's just to sort of extend what you said at a more macro level.
I mean, back to the issue of the state. How do we think that Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, can navigate situations where some of the diaspora's priorities conflict with its own geopolitical realities? So we mentioned Karabakh before, and of course we know we were discussing the earthquake and this kind of first moment of contact between the diaspora and the Republic coming in moments of tragedy. But do we find that stirrings in the diaspora are affecting policy in the Republic?
Politics is weekend.
Okay, so I think that. Okay, just to answer the question in the current context, I think there's not only a very big misunderstanding between Armenia and the diaspora, especially after the 2020 Second Karabakh War and what happened afterwards, but I think in general, within the Armenian world in general, within Armenia, within the diaspora, the relationship between Armenia and the diaspora, it's very much influenced, affected by the war, the defeat, because simply I think Armenians were not ready for the war, were not ready for this kind of war, and were not ready for this kind of defeat. And I think one of the big gaps is that we don't have an explanation. Neither the political leaders nor our academic intellectual structures gave us a narrative that explains what happened and then tells us, okay, this is what happened, and now we have to move in this direction. So kind of 5 years after the war and 2 years after the ethnic cleansing of Karabakh, I think this thick shadow of the defeat is kind of influencing negatively Armenian political life. And somehow, I think everyone sees this very clearly. There's this very strong polarization, very toxic discourse. And the only way I see to go out of this is to have an honest discussion between all kinds of political actors, whether within Armenia or within the diaspora or between the two, because we need on different levels this conversation to take place to kind of understand what happened, the depth of the disaster, how this defeat also revealed dysfunctional system that we have, and propose some positive steps forward so that we go beyond this stage of Armenian history and have a vision of where we can move towards in the future.
Great.
Can I pick up an earlier
Please.
discussion, particularly with Razmik and Tatiana here? Of course, we're talking about diaspora, and diasporas are defined at least partially by a relationship to a homeland. However that is imagined or real, and we all know that the situation, if we're concentrating on the Western old diaspora, it's not a homeland as such in terms of an ancestral homeland. It's a relationship that has been somewhat forged, but it is a project that most Western diasporans are invested in one way or the other. But one aspect that goes alongside some of the kind of return, if you like, within the kind of diasporic discourse and the repatriation that Tatiana was talking about is actually Armenia becoming a homeland as a space of refuge. And something that we should really take very seriously is the role that Armenia has played in recent years as a new homeland, or at least a temporary home for Middle Eastern Armenians, whether from Iran, from Cairo, from Beirut, especially since the bombing, Syrians since the war. Very large number of Armenian Syrians relocated to Armenia. Many have stayed for a while and gone somewhere else, right? Gone to very often the Gulf. Again, I'm really interested in the kind of circuits that are being traversed by the diaspora, where Armenia plays a role of a home or a transit site for many people. So I think this is something that we do need to be thinking of in terms of the kind of role that Armenia plays for diaspora and how important it is, particularly for diasporans in those regions where actually, Armenia becomes a place to kind of regroup, be safe, maybe reconsider, but also potentially stay, right? And there are, in my own research, I have been looking at, people who have made the commitment to stay at least for a while.
If I can just add to that, because I think you raise a very interesting point. So one of my challenges with data is that if you go and ask the Armenian government, where has your migration come from in the last 5 years? They can give you rough estimates, but they couldn't for certain tell you how many sort of Russians have maybe migrated, how many of them work in the IT sector. Trust me, we didn't get that data. But what we do know is that there has been a massive influx of migration. It's a positive net migration in the last few years. And I think Armenia has opened itself up to becoming a very cosmopolitan city. I just saw the other day somebody naming Yerevan as one of the best nightlife spots in the world, which I thought, wow, okay. It beat Athens, believe it or not. But what I'm getting at is that there's exciting things happening in Armenia. And so the aim that what we're trying to do at TAP, because we have been marred by, unfortunately, a lot of negative news, regions like Latin America suffer from the same problem. In the Anglo-American press, half the time when you read about Latin America, it's all about drug violence, cartels, murders, and corruption. The truth is that there's a lot more happening in Latin America than just that. There's so much innovation and exciting things, educational, arts, everything. So, and Armenia is going through that process as well in certain industries, in its culinary experiences, as a result of more migration of Western Armenians into Armenia, and also now international cuisines sort of making an appearance there. And then, of course, the wine sector, which has really opened Armenia up to a brand new audience of people. And suddenly people are realizing that wines originate from a region that most people had never heard of before. And so I think not only do we need to tell the international audience that, but the diaspora that doesn't know that, because unfortunately, there are people that are completely disengaged with the history of Armenia.
What I'm hearing a bit is this experience of the diaspora's diaspora, this type of movement back to Armenia, the repatriation and the experience that is maybe a bit disjointed from what the people in this room might know, not only because of our ages, but because we're not experiencing, maybe some of us have done birthright, but not everyone has. And of course, that affords a huge amount of time to invest in the Republic, which I find possibly the everyday person might not. Do we find perhaps, I mean, we can hopefully focus on the positives, but this relationship of repats in the Republic and the citizens of the Republic of Armenia, do we have data for how these populations are interacting, perhaps? Are there tensions? Are there challenges? We know a lot is there's prolific creation amongst these people, not only in terms of projects, arts, exhibitions, restaurants, certainly, but what else are we seeing?
You know, this is where I would love a research program where this would be formally analyzed, because I think whatever I say is going to be based on my own personal observation and anyone else who's, you know, been going to Armenia in recent history. So I do think there's a difference between what you see in the urban areas versus the rural areas. And I think, again, more research needs to be done about that, because there is also Armenia's real GDP growth was 5.8% last year, projected to be about 4.5 for the next sort of 5 more years. But how does that play out across the country? Again, that needs to be reviewed and looked at more carefully. But yeah.
Anecdotally, I mean, yes, research needs to be done, but first, the broader point. The biggest attraction to any migration, any country, is the success of the country. If the country is successful economically, culturally, whatever, has a good nightlife, whatever, so people go there. And I think the Armenian government has sort of understood that. It's not going to be over patriotic slogans. It's going to be about success in whatever field. But coming to your question, Erin, anecdotally, when I go to Yerevan, I talk to people, it's like any typical expat community. The diasporans who have gone to Armenia, it's an expat community. Expat communities, I don't mean to be offensive, but expat communities think that they have integrated. They haven't. You know, the expat communities are expat communities. Their children are not. Their children would be completely integrated, and we are seeing the children of expats who are 100% comfortable in New York and 100% comfortable in Yerevan, and they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so that's. But again, we have to remember we're talking about a minority. We're talking about a small, privileged minority who can afford to fly from Yerevan to New York. Tatiana's point is very valid. Armenia is not Yerevan. Armenia is Yerevan, and just like London is not Britain, it's not England, right? So it's the same thing there. So if we're thinking about policy, we're thinking about what to do in this country. We have to think about Yerevan, but we also have to think about the regions. We have to think about, and you know, you go to the countryside in Yerevan, and it's not much has changed in the last 20, 30 years. Right? Okay. Economically, they're slightly better, but not much has changed in terms of the insularity of how they see that. One of the projects that we recently supported is an interesting project about Merli. All this talk about the route, whatever you want to call it, through Merli. The people of Merli have no clue that they're in the center of this geopolitical game. Right. Like, how are they going to react to this? You know, when all these construction firms come and all that. So, you know, it's a small research project on trying to understand what the people of Merli actually think about all this. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
Well, I have slightly different impression because I lived in Yerevan the first 2 years after independence. So I spent 2 winters freezing there. And then I spent 3 more years around 2002, 3, 4, and I visit the country a number of times per year. So Armenia changed a lot. I remember those days when in Yerevan there were 3 functioning restaurants. So you can imagine the change. Now I take the point of Razmik that eventually what we decide is the job market in Armenia. And it's true that in Armenia, like all other post-Soviet countries, there's concentration of power, and political power and economic power has not been really separated yet in these countries, is in downtown Yerevan. But I have the impression that in the last few years, there's some trickle down taking place, and you see there's movement, new projects, construction, businesses, restaurants, branches of banks in provincial towns, and hopefully this will change, and Armenia will become more attractive to expats. But in that case, it's not necessary that they will be diasporans. You know, they might be Indian workers, they might be Iranians, I don't know. So Armenia will eventually face the challenge of many other countries having migrant workers and minorities, new minorities in the country.
The biggest issue Armenia faces, I think, in the long term, Armenia faces is demographics. It's not the war. The war, of course, it's a concern, but demographically, if the country is shrinking, and in 2100 we're going to see a country of 1 million or 1.2 million, which the trend seems to show, that makes the country not so viable. So you have to address the immigration issue. So how do Armenia address the immigration issue? Diaspora is one source, but it's not going to be millions. It's not going to be hundreds of thousands. Let's be realistic. It'll be few people. It'll be some elite folks. But where are these migrants going to come from? And Armenia doesn't have an answer to that at this point.
And what industries will they be from?
So, I mean, 2 years ago, after the Ukraine war, when I went to Russia, the novelty was that there were lots of Russians working in Yerevan. Not all of them were in the IT sector. Some of them were working in the restaurant sector. They were serving tables and all that, and they didn't speak Armenian. Half a year later, when I went, the novelty was that they were still there, but they were speaking Armenian. You know, they had learned enough Armenian to serve to Armenian clientele. So this wave, some of them might stay, some of them might not. But then you have the nationalist backlash, right? I mean, Armenia always faces this nationalist backlash. You know, all these migrants are coming, so the discourse is not new in Britain. You guys know that, obviously. So this is one of the huge issues for which I don't have an answer. I don't think we have an answer, but we need to think about this. And what is the diaspora's role in that it could play in making Armenia understand that it needs migration? Where is it going to come from? Where do you draw the line? And those are big, big questions that just as Britain is facing, Armenia is facing as well. It needs to face. Actually, it's not being discussed. It should be discussed, but it's not being discussed.
Do we get any sense internally that there's strategy going on to make the country more appealing, not just for tourism? We know all of us probably go back and forth to Armenia multiple times a year, but do we find any initiatives other than, birthright and it sounds like TAP is bringing in agents of visibility, journalists, but do we have any government?
I don't know. I don't know if Sossie Vicken know anything internally in terms of.
I mean, Repad, for example, has been, swamped by Armenians from Russia and Ukraine in recent years. So it's completely shifted from the Syrians when I first started doing research on this, now to the Russians and Ukrainians, and big numbers, not just Armenians, but
Russian and Ukrainian Armenians.
There's
Yeah,
a large
not
Jewish population migrating through Armenia.
That's right.
Onto Israel.
Yeah. So there are all these complexities that different groups like Repad, who have been quite nimble actually, and their strategy has been, really forward thinking and helped these various groups sort of come and then move somewhere else and so on. I do think that the presence of Armenian and non-Armenian Russians and Ukrainians has brought a new flavor to Yerevan, and Yerevan in particular, but not only Yerevan. And I think time will tell. I think some of them may stay. I mean, it certainly sounds like from the narratives that they feel secure, they feel reasonably at home. Many of them are working digitally, many of them are going back and forth. I think this kind of awareness of Yerevan in particular as being kind of a hub where people can go from one place to another, but also be based there for a while, whilst perhaps a family member is in the Gulf or back and forth to Syria. I think this is also quite a way of looking at Armenia in quite an exciting way. Like that potential also can be, I think, maximized for different groups of people.
And I mean, the tourism board does have a strategy, and they do actively encourage. I mean, that they're now visible. You go to any major international tourism convention, and Armenia is there, and they're sort of pushing their narrative alongside every other countries. And it is sort of paying off in many ways. I think also the going back to Sossie's point about repat and sort of the influx of inquiries, you are seeing. I think what you're seeing though is that so the stats are Armenia it's the 7th or 8th safest country in the world. That's a stat that is actively promoted, and I think that's something that appeals to a lot of people because we're always looking at it. I mean, I think about a place like Japan, and it's one of the safest places in the world, and that makes it a very appealing place to go traveling. And so, yeah, then you think about family raising. What needs to probably happen more of, and this is on the onus on the government rather than the diaspora, and this is where I think the limitations of the diaspora comes in, unless you're going in an advisory capacity, is advising them on how to make themselves more sort of attractive from a sort of economic perspective. Like what is the corporation tax there? Could it be lower? What are the opportunities for hiring people there versus hiring people in a different country? All of those things, and there's a budding startup community there, but policies need to be amended in order to make it a far more attractive place for startups to want to be there, but also for investors to want to invest in the startups in the region. We have a couple of unicorns and they've done well, but there's a lot of cool innovation out there, but you need the right kind of environment to attract the right kind of investment.
And Sossie, actually, you brought up this point of diasporans responding with humanitarian aid and but also with advocacy, representation, and now I'm thinking this skill set that is obviously critical in kind of developing these bridges, but also making Armenia and Armenian industries fluent in a type of not global, maybe global operations of how to run a business that can span across the diaspora and have its base in Armenia proper. Please.
I don't think it's the role of the diaspora to be kind of technical consultant to the Armenian government, because from the perspective of the Armenian government, if they want to solve a problem, probably they will not look for an Armenian diaspora for solving the problem. They will look for a consultant, an expert, international organization, a consultant company. So I think we should also know from the outside what we can do in Armenia and what we cannot do. Just like politically, sometimes I think diasporan political organizations, we misunderstood what are the limits, what we can do there and what we cannot do in Armenia. So I think this relationship needs more discussion and realism. And I think each time we overstated what we can do from both sides, we ended up in a crisis. And we are slowly coming out of this crisis, maybe. It's not well articulated because there's still this very toxic polarization, but in real terms, in real relationship, I think there's there's something more organic developing. So just to throw this out, because from the government perspective, it's a state, and what are we in the diaspora? We're just a network, right? So we should be realistic about our capabilities.
But Vicken, you have a point there, but I think this is where the thing about diasporans as institutions and diasporans as individuals come in. Of all these big things that are happening in Armenia, if you actually look behind the scenes, there is always an Armenian involved. There is big hundreds of millions of euros worth of investment is going into Armenia in the artificial intelligence sector. And you might say the government doesn't need the diasporans, but if you sort of look at it, you see that these corporations are going there because at one point, an Armenian in the diaspora played a key role in making the introduction between the prime minister and the CEO. And every case that I don't want to give names because I don't want to give away confidential conversations, but in every case when these companies have gone there, there's some sort of an Armenian behind the scenes. Intermediary. That's making the connections, that's making the advocacy, that is saying that Armenia is a safe place. It's one of the safest places. And now this is really increasing because geopolitically, Armenia is considered not war-prone, whereas before it was considered war-prone. So whatever you think of that politically, that's a different question. But this is important, and this is where individuals come into play. I mean, the one example I can give because it's very public is Synopsys, a big chip company, being present in Yerevan is because there is someone called Yerevan Zorian who was instrumental in doing that, right? So and there are many other cases like that. So yes and no. Institutionally, you're right. Institutionally, diaspora has no role to play. Diasporans as individuals, and the government of Armenia has come onto this. The government of Armenia is saying, thank you, keep your institutions. I take the individual key change makers.
And just to clarify, I wasn't suggesting that, we Armenians without any experience go in and advise the government. But yes, that is a very good point about Synopsys.
Yeah, I'm hearing this point a lot of assets, diasporans as assets, the diaspora as an asset to the Republic of Armenia.
And that's because certain diasporans feel that they own some allegiance to this state.
Mm-hmm.
And that's completely personal and emotional. It's not necessarily rational, but it's completely, and that's important.
If I can compare, and I'm not that I'm plugging my news organization, but The Economist did a really good analysis around the Indian diaspora and how the Indian government is betting a lot on their Indian diaspora. And it is, as Sossie was saying, it is being utilized to leverage stronger political relationships with countries like the US, where there's a large diasporan community. Obviously, in the UK, we have a large one because of our shared history, but we're also part of the Commonwealth, so it's a slightly different, but you are seeing them as a massive asset, and they are also leading some of the biggest tech companies around the world. So, it makes sense that the Armenian government's also getting wind of how, and I think maybe what we're all talking about here is how do we get more diasporans to understand the terms of a relationship, but who sets the terms, I guess is maybe a question for...
Yeah, I think like most relationships, there is some fluidity, right? And I think that it is a complex picture, and it is one that's evolving, as Vicken was saying. We are in a period now where things appear particularly estranged from one level. And I think the complexity is that actually we see many contradictory impulses. Like on the one hand, we see increasing estrangement, but we also see increasing engagement. And I actually agree anecdotally, again, because there's lack of research on this, but I have done some research on this. I agree with Razmik that on the individual level, people actually feeling like they want to do something, they want to be more connected, they want to make a difference. I'm hearing and seeing that much more, you know, both in Armenia and in diaspora, like within diaspora communities, people thinking about how they can do something or connect to Armenia outside of traditional institutional channels, more creative ways of doing them, building relationships and so on. And in a way, I mean, now that it's been, you know, a little bit of time since the loss of Artsakh, I think now we see these kind of contradictory tendencies. Like on the one hand, the great disappointment and the estrangement that is certainly, you know, experienced by many diasporans. But on the other hand, we see, you know, people even more committed to Armenia, making sure Armenia survives and so on, and very often through kind of individual channels and projects.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, so if I can add to that, which brings us to an important question. What, in this new context, what is the role of diasporan institutions vis-a-vis the diaspora? If we're saying that vis-a-vis Armenia, they're not that important anymore, and I think they still are, but vis-a-vis the diaspora, you know, what is their role now? And this is another profound moment in the diaspora. We're going through this rethinking of, you know, our traditional institutions, which they still govern a good part of the diaspora, and they mobilize. What's their role? You know, what is the role of the diaspora in general? So I think those are questions we have to think through. Yeah.
With that, I will bring our discussion to a close, and I will reiterate Tatiana's point that we are at the Armenian Institute a yes and institution. And I have to say, the more that we hold these types of events, also in connection with the heritage of displaced projects, I really am so pleased to see in one room, in one Zoom room constantly, past, present, future of this London-based Armenian diaspora. And as Tatiana said, it is something that needs to be nurtured, and we hope to have more of these conversations. I think they're very rich and very productive. And it keeps us attuned to our community, which is, as Susan said, and as Susan and Razmik and many of the people in this room have been so instrumental in maintaining. So with that, I want to thank our speakers. And thank you to everyone on Zoom. We'll see you hopefully very soon. Thank you, Erica. And we're going to sign off from here.
Yes, thank you, Joel. I will end the Zoom streaming now.